Good afternoon. My name is John McWilliams. On behalf of the Milton Historical Society, I'd like to invite you, or welcome you, I should say, to the second of our three free lectures, part of this series this spring. And also want to thank you for your support, and by support, I mean this showing up. It means a lot to us. And also want to acknowledge Chuck Everett as a sponsor of the lecture series, and that we are pleased to be offering a topic today that is timely in observing Black History Month, February this month, which, by the way, is also observed in Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, where they call it Black Achievement Month. So, our speaker today, Bruce Teeple, is a graduate of Penn State University with degrees in history and political science, and he has been a columnist for the Center Daily Times, which is a local newspaper in State College. He is an author, local historian, and speaker at regional and national history conferences, as well as numerous local church, school, and social groups. He reviews grant proposals for the Institute, for the Museum of Library Sciences, as well for the History Channel's Save Our History program. He serves as regional and state judge for the National History Competition, and he sits on the organization's State's Advisory Council. He is an active member in the American Association for State and Local History, secretary of the Association's Small Museums Committee, and chairs the Small Museums Scholarship Committee. And every April, he coordinates 150 volunteers to participate in Penn State's Powwow, a celebration of Native American life and tradition that draws over 6,000 people every year to the Mount Nittany Middle School and State College. He has published a book titled African Americans in Union County, Enslaved and Free, and he also has written chapters for Small Museums Toolkit, and another with the intriguing title Zen and the Art of Local History. He is currently president of the board of our neighboring Union County Local Historical Society. So please welcome Bruce Teeple, who will talk to us today about slavery in Pennsylvania.
Savage told me the other day that I should make sure I use the microphone, because I guess a lot of people have trouble hearing in the past. Wait till you get my age. There we go. Thank you all for stopping by today and for inviting me to speak. Can everybody hear? Everybody can see the slides okay? Let's start by looking at a copy of a document I found years ago. That's the original copy, and all right. I don't even have a cell phone. That's how low tech. Anyway, this is an article agreement between William Hoover in Walker Township, Suffolk County, State of Pennsylvania, and Jacob A. Stover of Haines Township, County and State aforesaid of the other part. The said William Hoover has bargained and sold his right titles and all claims of Alice that he now holds were bought of Jacob Emmerich for the term of 5 years to Jacob A. Stover for the sum of $50, lawful money. $10 of the said sum, which is to be taken in leather at cash prices against the first day of April, 1,825, at which time the said William Hoover is to give Jacob A. Stover aforesaid possession, whereunto we do interchangeably set our hands and seals this 28th day of April, A.D. 1824. William Hoover and Jacob E. Stover. The spellings are exactly as they appear in the original document, so don't fault me for that or the lack of commas. Incidentally, I think we can also explain the discrepancy between the Jacob A in the text and the Jacob E in the signature as due to pronunciation. In German, E is pronounced as A. Okay, so what's going on with this document? Let's take a closer look. In April of 1824, we had William Hoover, a farmer from Walker Township in Center County, as one party. Now that's around Hooversburg, just below Lamar. Maybe you could go at a better angle. I don't know, we'll find out. You go sit down there. Teamwork. Aim it at the machine. Yep. No, it's for the circle. All right. What does this X between Hoover's first and last name mean? You can't read or write. You're okay now? Okay. Hoover agrees to sell his right title on all claims of Alice to Jacob Stover of Aaronsburg for $50. 10 of those $50 will be made up as leather goods because Stover is a tanner. Okay. The name Alice is added. Okay. The name Alice is added with a caret, almost as an afterthought. This document causes us to ask a few more questions. Who or what is this Alice? Is it a male or is it a female? Is it an animal or a human being? From another document dating 2 years earlier, I found that a bull, the most expensive farm animal, cost about $10 at a public sale. This Alice has a name, except we never see names like Elmer or Daisy, for example, associated with the sale of bulls, cows, or any other farm animals on a legal document. But what doesn't this Alice have? A last name. And it's going for $50, about $2,500 today. So it must be more versatile than a bull. We can infer from the buying and selling of this Alice that maybe it's a human being. But if that's the case, can we really call Alice a human being legally if it's being bought and sold? 1824 is a bit late for indentured servitude. So it could be an enslaved person, even though the word slave is never mentioned. Slave, $50 was the average price for female domestics at the time. Well, why was Alice bought and sold in 1824, 44 years after Pennsylvania passed its first abolition law? And what did this phrase, for the term of 5 years, mean? What was going on here in central Pennsylvania in the early 1800s? You'll notice I kept calling Alice it. There's a reason for that. Because at various times in our history, the legal status of this thing, this Alice as a human being, constantly changes. And that's what we'll explore today. Pennsylvanians of African descent had to experience enormously frustrating changes, generation after generation, on the international, national, as well as local stages. We can trace Pennsylvania's ambivalent attitude toward Africans and enslaved people all the way back to the state's namesake, Admiral Penn, not his Quaker son, William. The king was indebted to the admiral for encouraging enslaved people in Jamaica to overthrow their masters. This is hardly a popular uprising. English masters merely replaced the Spanish ones. And as was the case with many of this country's gentry, the younger Penn owned and preferred enslaved people of African descent at Pennsbury outside of Philadelphia. Many black Pennsylvanians may have been free, but they weren't necessarily equal. For the first 20 years, colonial courts tried black black-skinned people and white-skinned people in the same courts under the same laws. As the 1700s began, however, white Pennsylvanians feared a growing black population. A new slave-owning business class in Philadelphia gained more political power. 4,500 enslaved people made up about 2% of Pennsylvania's total population. But Philadelphia's population of enslaved people was considerably more, approximately 10%, with a third of them owned by merchants and shopkeepers. So the legislation established separate race-based courts. All blacks, free and enslaved, had to plead their cases before two juries, one of the defendant's peers and another made up the 6 richest local white men. That way they wanted to be sure, I guess, that justice was served. To give you an idea about the role of skin color during the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, let's look briefly at comments about another group from that period. Imagine a newspaper editor telling his readers that these sort of people who are generally of the most stupid, ignorant sort because they were unwilling to learn English. They stick with their own kind. They speak their own language. They practice their own religion, and they will soon outnumber us. Their swarthy complexion surely offends the purely white people who originally came here. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? That individual was this guy, Ben Franklin. In editorials and letters he wrote this kind of stuff, but he would change his opinion over time as Germans became accustomed to voting in numbers, lots of numbers. By 1726, Philadelphia's Black Code required enslaved persons to carry passes and avoid tippling houses. If your owner planned to free you, he had to post a 30-pound bond to ensure your future behavior was acceptable. Any free black person loitering or marrying a white person could be forced back into bondage. To cap off the oppression, black families also faced the prospect of losing their children for any reason, at any time. Whether free or enslaved, blacks lived a completely separate and subordinate existence, at least until the American Revolution. 4 years before this country declared its independence, British courts handed down a decision on what became one of the most overlooked causes of the American Revolution. That was the Somerset case, a ruling made in 1772 by Lord Mansfield, England's Chief Justice, who declared that slavery was no longer legal in Britain. Furthermore, if an enslaved person ran away and was later recaptured, it could not be returned to slavery. Imagine that shockwaves that decision is producing over here. They're telling us what to do with our slaves. The Somerset decision created as much fear and anger over here as did all the usual huffing and puffing we've heard about no taxation without representation. Exhaustive agricultural practices reduced the value of land, so enslaved persons became more valuable than land. And the fear of freed African Americans, especially if allied with Native Americans, loomed in everyone's mind. As Robert Parkinson, in his recent book, The Common Cause, has shown, men such as Ben Franklin and Lafayette sought aid from France and looked for something, anything, to unify 13 fractious divided colonies. Despite the considerable aid and assistance by African and Native Americans during the Revolution, these two, Franklin and Lafayette, and others, began exaggerating atrocity stories in the press, whipping up any pre-existing racism and exploiting these stories to advance their political agenda. This would be a recurring theme dominating American political discourse over the decades. We've all heard of the rights to life and liberty, but the third right, to the pursuit of happiness, began as the right to property. That was to justify slavery. Property rights always trumped religious and political beliefs to justify slavery, and we can thank John Locke, theoretician of America's Revolution, and a former investor in Britain's Royal African Company for this. The committee drafting the American Declaration of Independence, strangely enough, they blamed the king. It was his fault, they claimed, that we had slavery foisted upon us. The committee also changed Jefferson's original wording, all men are born free, to all men are created equal. This vaguely acknowledged the plight of both free and enslaved blacks without having to say so outright. But there was never any reason to worry. The Declaration's ringing ideals, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, would remain just that, ideals. For obvious reasons, the Declaration could never become the law of the land. When we serve in the military, or if we serve as politicians, we always swear to preserve, protect, and defend not the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution. 1776 was not only the year we declared our national independence, it was also the year Pennsylvania produced its first state constitution. Hailed as the earliest expression of radical yet practical democracy in the Western Hemisphere, this new state constitution was revolutionary for other reasons. All blacks were not just property now in the eyes of the law, they became sort of people again. Everyone, regardless of skin color, was now tried in the same courts. Free blacks could legally read, write, and own property. Everyone, both poor white as well as free black males, could vote. This was not out of altruism or sympathy, but out of a desire to stem corruption. It was a matter of practical politics. There was safety in numbers. Candidates couldn't possibly buy off so many votes. Whatever the motive, this right remained intact in Pennsylvania for the next 50 years. 4 years later, near the end of the Revolution, our state legislature passed a law. It's one of the first attempts in the Western Hemisphere to tackle the issue of slavery. It wasn't a complete abolition. It merely provided some steps toward gradually freeing those of African descent. Pennsylvania always liked to trumpet its abolition law as the nation's first, but compared with other states over the following decade, that step was small and overrated. This was an abolition act mostly in name only. Few took it seriously, few except the courts. Under this law, property rights again took precedence. Slave owners had 6 months to register the name, age, sex, and occupation and place of residence of any slave born after March 1st, 1780. Anyone born before that time would remain enslaved unless the owner freed it. If the child was born to an enslaved mother after that date, it was considered free, but not so fast. That child, called a term slave, had to work its first 28 years. Think about it, because they and their mothers had been slaves, if only for 28 years. Technically, any child of these term slaves could provide free labor until they turned 28, and so on. The system and the money that it made, this could go on forever. The cruelest joke, though, was that, yeah, you'd be free when you turn 28, but if you're black, your average life expectancy was only 33 years. This most likely explains Alice's 24 sale in Center County. Legally, she was one of those term slaves who, as stated in the contract, had 5 years of service left before she turned 28. So she was probably about 23 years of age. Incidentally, Alice and Jacob Stover, the owner, lived in the house next to mine in Aaronsburg. Talk about the girl next door. Census records don't help us get a good grasp of the bigger picture. The official number of enslaved persons in Pennsylvania by 1830 and 1840 appears to drop rapidly, but this is misleading. The true number of enslaved people in Pennsylvania is unknown because the census was listing these enslaved people, these turned slaves, as servants. Unfortunately, this semantic quibbling obscures two other critical points: that the courts only addressed cases brought up before them, and two, we have no idea how ignorance of the law kept many legally free black children in bondage. Okay. No wonder it took 2 generations for this law to actually free it. Few owners lost money because they merely sold their slaves off in New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Pennsylvania's legislature and courts constantly had to address the problem of slave owners circumventing the law. Over time, the courts slowly determined that owners could no longer haul pregnant mothers over the border into slave states. If you forgot to register that slave mother or child, both had to be set free. If you changed the name of your slaves after registration, they also had to be freed. Slave holders could also lose their property if they did not provide precise birth dates when registering enslaved children. And enslaved couples could not be separated by more than 10 miles. Pennsylvania's abolition acts opened up a host of other problems. Any enslaved people brought into Pennsylvania, except by congressmen, of course, were to be declared free within 6 months. Pennsylvania's laws even caused hardship for slave owners, like President Washington. He complained to his fellow slave owner, Robert Morris, about the oppression when happy and contented slaves are seduced to leave their masters. In Washington's eyes, abolition introduces more evils than it cures. While serving as president in the Capitol, then in Philadelphia, Washington evaded Pennsylvania's abolition law by secretly swapping his Philadelphia slaves with the 300 he kept back in Mount Vernon before the 6-month deadline passed. This kind of democracy under the Articles of Confederation, where individual states conflict with a weak central government operating under these articles, did not sit well with European investors. They believed these reforms were too democratic and created too much uncertainty, so they refused to back investments made by the Founding Fathers and post-revolutionary land speculators. The latter, particularly Pennsylvania's slave merchant Robert Morris, as well as James Wilson, moved quickly to control these so-called democratic excesses and to tighten their hold on the nation's financial future. They called for a constitutional convention in 1787. Ostensibly, they were only going to strengthen the government's ability to protect shipping and negotiate trade deals. The group instead met behind closed doors and hammered out a new federal constitution that overrode the state's constitutions. From the very beginning, slavery was branded squarely on the heart and soul of the entire nation. In order to get Southern states to ratify the new federal Constitution, the convention adopted Wilson's Devil's Bargain, his suggestion to count every enslaved person, including women and children, as a fraction, as 3/5 of a person. While black slaves never voted for their own direct representation in Congress, 60% of them were counted, but that was only to jack up the number of bodies for apportionment. This action favored states below the Mason-Dixon line because a larger proportion of the general population were slaves. In other words, every enslaved man, woman, and child entitled the owner to greater voting power. If you owned 100 slaves, you got 60 extra votes. Southern slave owners had a disproportionate level of power and influence over national affairs. They didn't have to answer to anyone. They came from a smaller pool of possible candidates, who in turn represented a smaller population, percentage of the population. And they were the ones who would control the direction and the subsequent narrative, a history rarely told, even as our generation grew up. The new federal government also required the states to help the federal army suppress any uprisings by enslaved or by native people. One other agreement reached during deliberations over the new federal constitution was to ban U.S. participation in the international slave trade by 1808. The vague hope and belief was that as the new federal government eventually grew stronger, slavery would somehow wither away by then. Emancipation would just not be in the lifetimes of our founding fathers or in their backyards, and it certainly wouldn't adversely affect their persons. By the 1790s, France's Revolution dashed any American hopes of wooing European investors. Congress was less sympathetic about the plight of slaves. Action on slavery was limited to the peculiar institutions westward expansion and to dealing with the growing problem of runaways. The first fugitive slave law, passed in 1793, encouraged the local magistrates to help slave catchers kidnap fugitives. Any legislation freeing enslaved people had to come from the states. Small groups, motivated by a belief in natural rights and religious morality, began agitating for reform. We also find a body of work over the past 40 years contradicting many of the old truths we learned about slavery when we were in school. And here are two of them. Only Quakers took the moral high ground. In fact, we find that most ethnic Germans did not own slaves out of religious conviction, with many members of the Reformed Church, now the United Church of Christ, also actively assisting runaways. Besides, Germans are generally thrifty. Why pay good money for a slave when you can get that labor for free by breeding your own children? And Quakers were divided over slavery, so much so that the issue caused what was known as the Hicksite split within the faith. The next one was slavery only existed in the South. In fact, the 1790 census shows that about 3,700 enslaved African Americans, or 1% of the population in this state, including about 100 here in what was then Mother Northumberland County. Most of them were domestics, or laborers. The laborers traditionally worked at iron furnaces, and female domestics generally worked on farms owned by the new Scotch-Irish landed gentry. They were a status symbol around here. And these self-styled gentlemen, modeling themselves after the British aristocracy, were overwhelmingly ethnic Scotch-Irish and English. Slaves were a luxury, not yet a necessity. Few people, if any, could afford to own more than one or two enslaved people because an 18th century slave cost about a year's wages. And their value was relatively limited compared to what would happen over the next 15 years. Enslaved people in the South at first worked mostly on Virginia's and Maryland's tobacco plantations, or on sugar, rice, and indigo plantations at lower latitudes. But no one was prepared for the social, political, and economic chaos that struck the country when a way was found to extract cotton seeds from cotton fibers using the new cotton gin, short for engine. As we entered a new century, the days of homemade, labor-intensive linsey woolsey were numbered. Widespread use of the newly developed gin allowed Southern slave owners to replace tobacco, rice, and sugar with cotton as the dominant product. They expanded their operations and became more efficient. Enslaved people could now spend more time picking cotton than in picking seeds by hand out of the fibers. Cotton fever seized the nation with get-rich-quick schemes and dreams flooding the Southlands. The wheels of industrial-scale slavery, now based on cotton, began to move and shape political discourse. The timing could not have been more opportune. Why depend on overseas sources of enslaved labor anymore? The 1808 ban on participating in the international slave trade wasn't passed out of the goodness of anyone's hearts. It actually increased the value of slaves already owned almost overnight. Why? Because the ban shut out any foreign competition. It became a windfall as the value of slave holdings shot through the roof. And lots of people wanted to get in on this action. Now, you could breed your own slaves. You could mass produce them for free and for sale. They weren't just enslaved workers anymore, laboring for free. They were now seen as human capital, as investments, as actual commodities, as things to be bought and sold. Except now, it was on an unprecedented scale because the demand for this labor to grow and pick cotton had exploded. Out of 12.5 million African Americans that came to this hemisphere, only about 500,000 actually landed on our shores before the international ban. But by 1860, most of America's 4 million enslaved people weren't from elsewhere. They were born here. Why pay for something that you can get for free? What accounted for this 8-fold increase in our country's slave population? It was the breeding program that had gone on full swing, mostly in Maryland and Virginia, feeding the insatiable labor demands farther south. Slaveholders called it natural increase, even though it was rigorously managed the same as any investment, such as livestock. Enslaved people, in fact, were seen as Virginia's main domestic crop. Jefferson, for example, bragged how the sheer number of black children born, that number by itself, was boosting the Commonwealth of Virginia's capital stock by 4% a year. More and more couples of chained black men, women, and children began shuffling southward. And why? Their value not only rose as plantations in other states produced rice, cotton, and sugar, their value increased as these states kept expanding their borders. The more slavery spread, the more breeders could count on reaping profits by increased demand and from increasing prices. As it stood, the system could conceivably go on forever. No wonder the Southern plantation class was so intent on protecting an entire economy built on enslaving and raping women and children. No wonder enslaved people were bringing more return on investments than anything anyone could imagine. No wonder Harriet Tubman had a price on her head for encouraging women and children to escape from the Eastern Shore. She understood, she attacked, and she undermined the system at its very root. That was the breeding program. Think of all those laws passed by state and national legislature. They merely maintained and fine-tuned this great machine, this slavery, smugly dismissed as our peculiar institution. Now, runaways had always been a problem. They just weren't organized on any great scale until the Underground Railroad began to form in the 1830s. This was a loose network, predominantly of free black people informally helping runaways. And this activity barely made a dent in the entire, or the total enslaved population. And there was no such thing as slave quotas. So if you hear any of that nonsense, put it out of your head. It's a nice story, but it's not true. At most, it's estimated that only 1,000 to 2,000 people a year actually escaped. But they didn't just run north here to Pennsylvania, long seen at least before 1850 as the best place, where you had a lot of little pockets like West Milton, Bellefonte, and other established black communities throughout the north and central part of the state. They're also fleeing west to Texas and Mexico, with a significant number over time becoming cowboys. Let's face it, no self-respecting white person in those days was interested in pursuing the cowboy lifestyle. And they fled south, especially into the swamps of Florida, where they exchanged survival skills and intermarried with groups such as the Seminoles and Cherokees and Choctaws. But this created a situation that tested the patience of the U.S. government and of the new self-styled slave-owning aristocracy. 1838 was a watershed year. It was only 7 years after Nat Turner's rebellion. We were also nearing the end of one of the longest and most expensive wars ever fought by this country, the Seminole Wars. This war had been the white man's worst nightmare come true. The two most oppressed groups in our history, Native Americans and African Americans, had joined forces. They were organized, they were armed, they held off the army for years, and they were winning. This forced President Jackson, in effect, to invade Spanish Florida and use the army illegally as slave catchers. For more information, I heartily recommend looking at johncourse.com. I guarantee you won't regret it. In the meantime, Pennsylvania is passing a new state constitution. Ever since the 1776 state constitution was passed, free blacks had enjoyed the right to vote. That was the change. In spite of growing abolitionist sentiment nationwide, Pennsylvania's court decisions in the 1830s reflected widespread social discrimination. Citizens no longer wielded the raw public power they had under the state's 1776 Constitution. Women, natives, immigrants, and blacks became the easiest targets for white males to vent their rage and frustration. Now we can see how the public perception of these events led to calls for Pennsylvania to pass a new state constitution in 1838, a state constitution specifically prohibiting black suffrage. The Commonwealth never completely abolished slavery until 1848, long after its official existence here had become moot. True to the Founding Fathers' belief, and no thanks to them, it took over 68 years for slavery in Pennsylvania to wither away. The state's 1850 census stopped recording numbers of enslaved persons. They didn't officially exist. Yet untold numbers of term slaves, such as Alice, born to enslaved mothers, still remained in bondage. Since Pennsylvania's courts were still ruling on slavery laws up until the eve of the Civil War, the institution had to be surviving, if not thriving. But the slavery issue didn't stop then and there. Too much money's being made. Before the 1850s, most abolitionists were regarded as crackpots. Two events during that decade, publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin and passage of the federal 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, fueled wider resistance to the horrors of slavery. By the 1850s, 2/3 of the richest people in this country would live in the South. Most of their money was tied up in slaves. They, along with those Northerners who shared their interests, were the designers and the drivers behind the most oppressive law ever passed in this country. And that law, that evil nightmare, was the 1850 Federal Fugitive Slave Act. But this new law attempted to resolve the problem of runaway slaves. It was the first time the government tossed out the writ of habeas corpus. If you were seized, no one had to tell you why you were arrested, and you couldn't provide any evidence contradicting that claim. Incidentally, the Constitution says that suspending habeas corpus is only legal during an invasion or rebellion. That's not the case here. So what? The heart of the nation's economy is at stake. And besides, we're talking about runaway animals here, not human beings. According to this law, any white person could claim that any black person was a runaway. Blacks could not provide proof of their freedom. If you refused to help recapture runaways, you faced a hefty fine and jail term. Presiding judges were paid $10 for returning runaways to their masters, and only $5 if they were freed. If you helped a runaway, if you even gave that runaway a sip of water, you could be fined $1,000 and given a 6-month jail sentence. And on top of that, you had to pay the slave owner an additional $1,000 for the inconvenience you caused him. As a result, every one of the 150,000 free blacks throughout the North, theoretically, could be taken back into slavery. Even that black person you were thinking of hiring at your furnace could possibly be a fugitive. You just didn't know. In 1854, President Franklin Pierce ordered 1,500 federal troops to escort a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns from Boston back to Virginia. So how many whites were going to risk a jail term and a fine? As you can see, it didn't take much for this to undermine any relationships, any goodwill blacks may have had with their white neighbors. This law finally scared enough of those established black families to leave Pennsylvania and head for Canada. Previous fugitive slave laws were ineffective. Northern states not only prevented their judges from hearing fugitive slave cases, they prohibited federal officials and private slave catchers from using state jails to hold runaways. As a result, southern states were outraged, complaining that the northern states, especially Pennsylvania, refused to obey the law. And why were these northern states harboring these fugitives? Because these northern states were exercising their states' rights. Incidentally, you won't see any southern state mentioning that sacred principle of states' rights when they seceded from the Union. The only thing we hear in all of their statements about secession is the need to defend their God-given right to own slaves. Look at it another way. The value of enslaved people in this country before the war exceeded the dollar value of all this country's railroads, banks, and manufacturing combined. A lot of jack involved here. We can look at this another way. In a recent address by the Supreme Court Historical Society, Michael Ross at the University of Maryland estimated that the amount of money spent on fighting the Civil War would have been enough to pay for every man, woman, and child in bondage. Not only that, there would have been enough left over to give every family that 40 acres and a mule. And Lincoln made that offer twice. The law had created both a refuge and a stacked deck. It took another 100 years for the courts to break the lack of resolve and become a potent weapon in the quest for social justice. Look at it this way. A piano has 88 keys. Would you prefer to have the music of Duke Ellington or Chopin come off of that piano to elevate your heart and soul? Or would you rather listen to a 6-year-old pound out chopsticks over and over again and again. I think now you can appreciate the beauty and the potential that's unleashed when we uncover lost histories, when we unlock that diversity, when we learn to play every one of those 88 black and white keys in harmony with each other. Why cover this history? Because if you don't have a history, no matter how unpleasant or evil it is, how can anyone, as an individual or as a nation, create and shape their future from lessons learned? If you deny or disguise, neglect or diminish, whitewash or erase the past, how can you learn anything new or even claim that you're becoming a better human being? Thank you. Anyone have any questions, comments, criticism, complaint? I'm shocked, John. Oh, good.
Were there any underground railroads in this area?
Yes, ma'am. There's not a lot of activity. They're running up along the river for the most part to Pennsdale in that region. The Underground Railroad has a place in history. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, it is blown up to make it seem like it was only Quakers that were running this thing. You know, the little old lady with the dust ruffle in the middle of the night holding the lantern. There was nothing of the sort. It was predominantly free blacks helping others. Let's face it, you're on the run. Who are you going to go to? The white guy or the brother? You know, it makes sense. And so that's the reality of the Underground Railroad. All this nonsense about slave quilts really gets my goat along with a lot of professional historians. It makes you feel better about the institution instead of actually looking at what actually happened. You know, we get this feel-good nonsense being peddled a lot of times by people. Of course, it's good for Joann's and Michael's and all the fabric shops thinking you're helping out, promoting slavery or promoting history. It's nothing of the sort.
Could you say more about slave quilts? I read about it a little bit, but I forget.
All right. About 25 years ago, there was a woman who went to a shopping mall of some sort, said there were some quilts and whatnot being sold there. And this old black woman had peddled this story about there are certain images and codes, secret codes on the quilt faces. And then she started really shoveling it out. And this woman took it. It's all about money. Nobody ever found this woman, because this is the story that was told. No one ever found this woman, and the thing was that this book is written, and it's being peddled as a quasi-historical account. There must be some truth to it, and really there was nothing at all. It just never made sense.
Way back in the day.
Yeah, well, as Karen James said, she was in the historical museum, she goes, you know, where's the guidebook? Where's the code book? How are you going to interpret these things if you're literate or illiterate or semi-literate? It was just a silly story, but you know, people ate it up, unfortunately. Yeah.
I know you wrote about the Dale House and the slaves there. Are there any statistics on how many slaves there in the Union? What's now Union Cider?
Okay, in Northumberland County, there were about 100 slaves in the original Northumberland County in the 1790 census. That number would then gradually diminish as time went on as the Scotch, Irish, and English owners started moving out of the area. Dales were a good example. They would rent their farms out, as a lot of those people living in those limestone houses did. They would rent them out to tenant farmers. I'll be giving a talk in April at the library in Lewisburg on the history of the Dale House and how it was intertwined with the Union County. And John here says I'm supposed to also plug, 31st of March, we're having a free showing of Surrender, a movie about Elvira. We'll be at the campus theater. You'll see some publicity about that in the future as well. But anyway, yeah, I was pulled into the Dale Emma Walker property 15 or so years ago and asked to give a presentation. And then at the time, that's when they found out about this Dinah that was flooding at the house. No one's disputing the truth of that statement, but it did not play a role in any Underground Railroad activity. Then there's a whole bunch of other nonsense about the black man in the window and all this stuff. We've gotten away from that in the tours because it really doesn't have any relevance or pertinence to anything at all. We don't diminish Dinah's role. We see her for what she is. She's basically like a limestone house. She's a status symbol that you do, to show that you've made it in life. But that's the extent of it. She's hired as a domestic to help with child rearing and cooking and all the household chores. But no, there was no actual activity. Why would you be involved with Underground Railroad activity if you have a slave on the property? So it never really made any sense. And so that's one thing with history. You constantly are changing as new information comes in all the time. You're constantly changing your interpretations, and that's not a bad thing. We'll go to you back.
Could you hold the microphone a little closer?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm losing the question and answer.
Okay.
Yeah, the McClure House in Lewisburg claims to be part of the Underground Railroad. Do you have any additional information on what really was there?
Let's put it this way. With local history, a lot of times it's seeing whose manure fork is bigger. I'm not saying that it wasn't involved, although I did see an article in a newspaper from 1912 where there was a barn, I think on 522, that was supposed to have captured slaves, I guess enough for 50 slaves and manacles, all sorts of, falling for that one. Or that people were keeping their slaves. Nobody had 50 slaves around here. They were just too expensive. That would have been something down south you had. You wouldn't need 50 slaves around here for the size of these farms. Especially if you can breed your own kids. Yes?
Accurate to say that Pennsylvania, the northern states' position on abolishing slavery, etc., was based on geography at the time?
Yes, because you can only grow crop cotton down south. You can't really grow anything of on any scale. You're still clearing the land up here, for one thing, and most people were growing grains like wheat through the 1800s, or late 1700s, early 1800s. But cotton, there's going to be a demand of the market for that because you can make all sorts of clothing in particular. So Lindsay Woolsey's out, cotton's now in. So the demand is there, the demand for the labor is there. That's why the institution grew from 1790 up until the Civil War. That's how much of an effect it had on this country.
The New England states primarily benefited greatly from the cotton production.
Oh, and the slave trade too. They were benefiting from that. You had that triangle between the southern ports of Charleston over to England. They're manufacturing, turning the cotton into clothing or manufactured goods, and then and it's going back and forth between New England. And then Samuel Slater. I have to laugh. We complain about the Chinese stealing technology from this country. We did the same thing to England. A guy named Samuel Slater. The English passed a law stating that it was illegal to bring drawings of the mill operations over. Slater just memorized it all, then came over to New England, and that's how that whole industry started. And this goes on, that's going on forever. Stealing of technologies. Anyone else?
Bruce,
Yes, ma'am.
how about the House of Many Spheres of Pennsdale? I understood they were white owners of that house, and that was a part of the Underground Railroad.
I haven't heard any. All I know with Pennsdale is that there was, I guess there still is a Quaker
Still is
community.
there.
Okay, a Quaker community there, and yes, that was an active location. As for how many went through, I don't know.
But were they white owners helping the blacks?
As far as I know, they may have been.
That's what I was always.
Right, but overall, and we're talking from here all the way through the Ohio Valley, the majority of people helping are going to be free blacks helping runaways. Yes,
Can you clarify exactly how the 1848 Constitution
38.
38 changed the slave laws? Because obviously if it abolished them, the courts wouldn't have been hearing.
We abolished slavery in 1848, but that's mainly because the number of slaves that were owned by that time had gone down to virtually nothing. But there was, officially, but there were still a lot of people who were unaware of what was going on. Or, the slaves were unaware of what was going on.
I thought maybe it was a deal where if I'd have been born a year before that law went into effect, I still had to go to my 28th birthday or something. So in 1848, anyone who was a slave was definitely.
That was just abolished completely. By that time, the public sentiment was really against the whole institution completely in this state. Yes?
Just before the Civil War broke out, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina were the three richest states in the United States. Mississippi and Louisiana were one of the first. But at the end of the Civil War, they were the poorest, and pretty much been since then the poorest. So it was all about cotton, and all that cotton was exported to England. So that's what the war was about. And they knew that there was no way you could work these plantations without slaves, just no way. And your productivity went up as time went on because you had about the same number of slaves producing more and more productivity.
The other thing is, too, that's overlooked is W.E.B. Du Bois come out with a thesis that was disputed for years and years and is now being realized as accurate, that the war ended a lot quicker because these slaves were leaving the plantations and joining up with the Union Army. And so they had to do something to keep this down before it got out of control. So, anyone else have any questions? Yes?
You mentioned about the black population in West Milton. Could you speak a little more about that?
All I know is that there's some things that were done here by Kate Hastings on that group here in this part of the county. But the black people that were living in West Milton generally were acting as domestics. They weren't enslaved, they're free blacks. And they would live over there for many years. I believe there are still a few families still living in town. But, I'm not that familiar. I live in Center County, so my problem is I've been learning more and more about Union County. There are a lot of parallels with what I see in Union County and down here in the valley. But as for all the particulars, it's coming to me as I talk with folks like you. Yeah, John.
You mentioned the 1738 State Constitution.
1830.
1830. Have you done much on indentured whites?
Not a whole lot, no.
That I know some through genealogy. I don't know if it came over from Germany. If in the time you started up the Rhine, you ran out of money, you got over here, the ship stayed out in the harbor. People came out on boats because you couldn't swim. You
Right.
stayed far enough out. And you could be indentured up to 3 years to pay off your
And when did he come over?
1738.
Say, by 1838, the system of indentured servitude is kind of falling away. So you got, more of a native-born population. There aren't a lot of, there aren't a lot of immigrants coming over here. Because a lot of founding fathers like Robert Morris, James Wilson, because they were buying all this land on this side of the Susquehanna, they would be able to gobble it up and then parcel it out to this wave of immigrants they were expecting to come over. Well, that would have been all well and fine, except you had a thing called the French Revolution. That put the kibosh on our law, and we never really had any major waves of immigration until the 1840s with the revolutions and with the Irish potato famine and the revolutions in Germany. So, the 1840s or so, it's pretty well done. There's Yes?
Why did the French Revolution put an end to immigration?
How do you want to get over here? That's
On a Dutch ship? I don't know.
yeah. Well, there were plans to get Marie Antoinette over here and establish her up in New Zealand. Incidentally, Ferensville, they were planning on bringing the Queen Christina from Spain to Ferensville outside of Lockheed. So chewing that one for a while. Yeah. So I mean, there were a lot of ideas of bringing over these threatened figures in royalty, European royalty. But the aristocracy just didn't make it. I mean, there were some families, for example, you walk around Saussure in Center County and Frenchville in that area, you still have some families. Kellersport, they were settled by some French emigres in the late 1700s, but for the most part, the immigration just didn't come across, or didn't come over. It just didn't come over here until much later. Anyone else? That was easy. All right. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Appreciate that, and appreciate you coming today again to support the community. Hope to see you 4 weeks from today, be March 10th, for our third and final lecture. So have a very good day. Thank you.